What do you give up by going for a cheaper tier of phone? I will be comparing Google's 2025 flagship, the Pixel 10 Pro, against their cheaper A phone from 2024, being the Pixel 8a. The 8a has just 2 cameras compared with the 10 Pro's 3. The Pro has an extra telephoto, which will really help give it an advantage when you're zooming in theory. I need to keep the suspense up a bit here. But there are more differences between them than simply that, because even the 2 cameras that the 8a does have, being ultra-wide and standard, are inferior. Not in terms of megapixels, well, the wide angle is, but they're smaller in terms of sensor. But it will be interesting to tell if, in practice, there's a meaningful difference between the qualities of these sensors. So let's start with the main sensor, which is the one I assume will be used in most instances. And I've learned from my testing for this video how hard it is to line up 2 images taken at the same time. It's hard to align them perfectly up on the screen. It's harder still to actually press the photo buttons on both the phones at the same time without jogging each other. For phone testing, you really need some kind of phone gun that snaps a pic with one and then swaps out for another phone in exactly the same spot for a like for like. So I did my best for this video, but if the images don't fully line up, then this is why, and know that I tried really hard and I looked like a right moron for several hours in the making of this video. My normal analysis is just to get a few things and to do them in depth. But when it comes to taking pictures with phones, I'd rather go for more quantity. So I'll be doing a load of side-by-sides and my commentary as I scan around the images. And here it is, the very first comparison picture I took between the 2 phones. And it's a bit of a surprise. So the Pixel 8a makes the red traffic lights look much brighter. I think the Pixel 8a does a better job here. And also on the building behind, the God Center, a lot more texture detail. Even on the trees I prefer the 8a, it's just overall a much better picture than the 10 Pro is producing. Here's another direct comparison between the 2 cameras, and another thing that stands out to me is how sharp the Pixel 10 Pro's image is. It's overly sharp. It makes this foliage look almost like a water painting compared to the 8a's more natural look. Same with the architecture on the front of this building, it just looks overly sharp. It might appear to bring out more details in some places, like on this metal here, but that's only because it looks sharper. I prefer the 8a, if I'm honest. And another thing I've noticed, and this is really bad, oh yeah, number plate out of focus on the 10 Pros, whereas it isn't on that one, look at this visible jitter. Now I think this is due to pixel binning. They're both probably pixel binning their images down, but because the 10 Pro bins down to just 12 megapixels, I think it makes any artifacts more obvious. Whereas this 8a's higher megapixel camera pixel bins down to 16 megapixels and then is resized down to 12, which I think makes any pixel binning artifacts more subtle. So I think the artifacts are still there, they're just not as visible as on this one here. I found another bit just here, look at that, look at all these dots, look at that. None of them visible here, so I'd say that this is another win for the 8a. Now I was saying in my previous video that the 10 Pro is capable of saving at 50 megapixels instead, and I think that would go a great way towards improving its outputs in these situations. So here's a very different comparison image. Some harsh lighting on the window, which the 10 Pro shows more detail from, though a slight purple tinge, which isn't so good. Overall, I would say that the 10 Pro is slightly sharper here, so I think we'll just have to compare lots of different images and see overall which one does better, because so far it's kind of like 1-1. I really think in this example, it's the resolution of the cameras that's letting them down. And this is where the 10 Pro has one big advantage, because it can shoot in full 50 megapixels. Now I'm comparing the 8a's 12 megapixel image against the 50 megapixel 10 Pros, and immediately the 10 Pro gets the advantage. Or does it? I mean, it just looks blobby on the tree to me, while that looks a lot more tree-like. So it's almost like the 10 Pro is just over-sharpening the result. But elsewhere on the image, you can definitely make out that there's more detail. Sorry for not being better at lining up these images, but the extra resolution lets you read out bespoke homes. Can't read it there. Higher resolution makes this railing look much nicer than this. I think the larger file size gives more detail on this grass as well. So what's a shame is that I think the 8a is also capable of more than what's being shown here. It just doesn't have the software feature to allow it to capture in full 64 megapixels. Otherwise, I think these 2 images would be a lot closer. And in this example, really pixel peeping here, they both produce very nice looking images. Again, Pixel 10 Pro seems a little bit sharper in its results. You might prefer that. Oh, a little bit more dithering, slightly over sharpened. Oh no! Oh no! Oh! Oh! Doesn't look like the 10 Pro likes all this moving water. It's got these telltale vertical lines, which I think is from it trying to piece together multiple images over a time frame. Something that the 8A just isn't struggling with. The 8A's extra resolution is giving it an advantage in these ideal situations, where the lighting is good, a lot of light is hitting the sensor even if it is smaller, and I think it is just producing a slightly better looking image. Jesus Christ, have I downgraded? But now we'll gradually progress towards a lower light situation. So that I've stood here for like an hour, the sun is beginning to set. Not so much light will be hitting the lens now, so maybe the 10 Pro will start to get an advantage. I think it's limited by the JPEG'd artifacts, but close in result. 8A looks a lot greener, which I always associate with lower quality sensors, but yeah, it could just be on a per case basis here. There's not a lot about this comparison that makes me prefer one over the other than the colours, which I do prefer on the 10 Pro. But yeah, you're not really giving up much by going for a cheaper camera. Ooh, bit of fringing on the light, but then there's a bit of fringing on the other side here, so let's wait until it gets a bit darker again. So here we're now approaching low light. Here's the 8A, here's the 10 Pro. A bit more detail in the sky on the 8A. A little bit softer overall. I would imagine that the 8A sensor would start to struggle more in these low light situations, and you can definitely make out a lot more grain, which the 10 Pro doesn't have, either because its sensor is better or because it's processing it more. I don't necessarily mind the look of grain, but I'd give the win now to the 10 Pro. Although, it's making these stone steps look a little bit artificial and upscaled looking, while this, although grainy, does look a little bit more like rock. Yeah, it's a little bit over sharpened. Yeah, I'd probably say the 10 Pro is better, but again, I'm not going to regret taking this picture on an 8A. The colours again give it away that it's the 8A. It just looks slightly greener and there's quite a lot of bloom, which the 10 Pro doesn't have. Hopefully you can make out the same telltale green look that the 8A has compared with the 10 Pro. It just looks a little bit more artificial than this, which seems to have better blues. But yeah, so this is quite a dark scene. Let's compare detail levels. Yeah, 8A seems to win. What about at a distance? Still prefer the 8A. And this is in quite a dark situation. And you might go, oh, well, it's not fair because Google does long exposures and stuff, but then so can the 10 Pro. It doesn't have an excuse for not looking as good. No, I've got to say, I quite like the 8A's result here as well, even though I prefer the colours on the 10 Pro. A bit more detail at a distance too. Oh, Google! Come on. So I'm a big believer in quantity. Even when you take the same photo with the same camera several times, there are differences to the lighting and stuff. So here's another one between the two. And this could actually be a win for the 10 Pro. Don't know why I sound so surprised. It should be winning most of these. But yeah, it's brighter, it's got more detail on things. Doesn't look too overly processed now either. Yeah, I'd say that it's now beginning to win. This is just a bit blurry. Maybe the long exposure, because this is night setting, has been on for a little bit longer with the 8A. Maybe because the sensor is smaller, so it needs to be on for longer to produce the same result. Yep, this is a win for the 10 Pro, this is. On to the next one. Now this example here deserves special analysis because it shows so much. Just like with the traffic lights early on, you can see that the Pixel 10 Pro makes the brightness of this light lower, so you can see more detail inside the light. But I prefer how the Pixel 8A looks, and I think it's more natural and lifelike, because it does look like a big glowy bright thing in reality. I think there's a flaw with how the 10 Pro does HDR right now, where the brightest bits of the image are darkened more than some other bits of it that aren't quite so bright, and it's causing it to look a bit weird when looking directly at bright lights. And secondly, you can really make out the HDR effect around the post of the light, where the water as it gets towards the post becomes darker and murkier, almost like it's being sucked into a black hole. So it's no secret, but Google does rely heavily on HDR to make the images the way they look. There's more purple fringing on the lights in the Pixel 10 Pro, for example, but overall I would say that the 10 Pro is a significantly better image. Just switching between the two, you can make out so much more detail with it, whereas the 8A is beginning to struggle in the low light. Well and truly into the night now, and a full moon to take pictures of. I know I've been quite harsh on the Pixel 10 Pro's excessive HDR, but it does a good job here of making it look circular like a moon. I'd say it over sharpens the trees a bit, But beyond that, this is where the Pixel 10 Pro begins to really pull ahead of the 8A. Firstly, in terms of colours, again, it's just too green on the 8A. It doesn't look like that. This is how it looks. Much nicer, moon set. And this is where the Pixel 10 Pro's larger sensor really begins to shine, being able to make out a lot more detail in the grass down here, whereas the Pixel 8A just reduces it down to a blobby mess. But you can still see the blades of grass on the Pixel 10 Pro and further out into the distance as well. It really is pulling ahead here under very difficult photographing situations. In this very low light scene, remember this is the moon, not the sun, the 10 Pro is bringing out a lot more detail, while the 8A is struggling to make out the sign. There's more detail in the dark areas of the image now on the 10 Pro. The waves have more detail on the 10 Pro, everything just has more detail. Although I've got to admit, the 8A's colours in this example are very similar to the much more expensive 10 Pro. Granted, this is using night mode, so it's a longer exposure picture, but then so's the Pixel 10 Pro. If the 8A can use it to reach the same standard set by the 10 Pro, then more power to that cheaper phone. But say you don't have time. This is without night mode on. So just what the phones can capture within a fraction of a second, as you can see from this biker walking by. Looks slightly more in focus on the Pixel 10 Pros, maybe it's got slightly shorter exposure time because its sensor can let in more light. Grass looks much better on the 10 Pro. The colours are more neutral on the 8A, I'm not sure if that's more accurate, but maybe looks a bit better. But in terms of detail, the 10 Pro is now pulling way ahead. And the dark areas of the 8A are just very grainy now. But I still think it's done a really good job, given that it is a much cheaper phone with a smaller sensor. In conclusion, the 8A's main sensor holds up remarkably well against the newer and much more expensive 10 Pros. It can even perform better than it in some instances, especially when conditions are good. What you get with the 10 Pro is a more reliable camera that will hold up better under more demanding conditions and in low light. What would you rather have? Better results in situations where both phones can do a good job already? Or would you rather have the more reliable results all round? I'm going to say that the 10 Pro would be my choice, and thank God, given that I've moved to it now, and it cost me money. I wasn't expecting to see so much difference to the colours between these two phones. Here's some footage from an old video camera of mine compared with a newer one. That's the feeling I got when comparing some of the images between the 8A and the 10 Pro. They may only be differences in colours, but I associate the 10 Pro's colours more with better products, while the 8A at some points fuzzes up and suffers from small sensor syndrome. I think this is completely forgivable on a product that costs just a fraction of the amount of the flagship. It's not so forgivable on a more premium phone, and this is where all the current drama is going on. The Pixel 10 Pro might have the best sensors all round, but the base Pixel 10 doesn't. In previous generations, like the Pixel 9 phone, it did use the same sensors as the 9 Pro did. But this generation, the Pixel 10 instead uses the same camera sensors as the cheaper and inferior and older Pixel 9a, meaning that this new phone could still suffer from the same low light drawbacks as I've seen from the Pixel 8a. And given that it's a lower megapixel sensor, it could be the worst of both worlds. So that's something to look out for if you're considering buying just the base Pixel 10. But let's not forget about the software side of things. Google is all about the software, and do occasionally patch up and improve their products through updates. And which of these phones do you think is more likely to receive future improvements? The 10 Pro, of course. That's what their engineers will be focusing on. I think the sensor seen in the 8A is done. What you see is what you'll get from that camera forevermore. Google doesn't tend to roll out new features and updates to older devices so much, and certainly not the budget 8A. That might actually be a selling point for some people. But I am hoping for updates to my new phone, especially with the weird way that the 10 Pro dulls super bright lights. It seems to favour retaining the colour of bright things more than to actually represent how bright those things are. And yes, that is still the case even when viewing them on the phone's HDR screen at full brightness and with HDR on and so on. It's not that the image detail is being lost when viewing them on other devices or anything like that. So that's it for the main sensor. Next up, the wide angle and zoom capabilities of both. And this could be a bit more interesting because in these regards the Pixel 8a should fall further behind the 10 Pro. But we'll see if the plucky little underdog can keep up next time.